right, today's story, we're going to talk about walking on water. And it's from Matthew 14, 22 through 33. And if you wonder, Matthew's the first book in our New Testament, the new part of the Bible. How many of you remember the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 hungry men, besides many women and children, with only 5 rolls of bread and 2 fish? Yes, many of you know that wonderful story. Our story today took place right after that, because many people were anxious to have a ruler who could feed them when they were hungry. They tried to take Jesus by force and make him their king. They didn't believe that Jesus' miracles were proof that he was doing his Father's works. All they wanted was someone with power to take care of them. Jesus knew that, and so, as soon as he could, he dismissed the multitudes of people, and then he urged his disciples to get into a ship and sail to the other side of the lake. He went to one of the nearby, so he made the crowd leave. And he told his disciples to get into a ship and start sailing across to the other side. They all needed a break from those big crowds. They just needed a break. And Jesus went up to the mountain to pray. So he went to one of the nearby mountains to pray, and he wanted to be alone and quiet so he could talk to his Father in heaven. The sun was getting low in the sky. The sun was going down. And soon it was going to be nighttime. The disciples got into their boat as Jesus had told them to, but they were slow getting started. No doubt they were hoping that Jesus would join them if they'd wait long enough. Perhaps they didn't want to leave Jesus alone on the mountain at night. It was getting dark when the disciples finally set sail on that glassy blue waters of the lake. But there was no moon or stars that night. A little later, as Jesus looked out over the lake from his place on the mountain, he could see that his disciples were in trouble. A storm had burst over the quiet water. The wind was howling, and the boat was tossed up and down on the high, dark waves. The weary disciples were trying their best to head their boat for the opposite shore, but the winds were against them. Though they worked hard, big, crashing waves kept pushing their boat back. It was getting near morning, yet the disciples were only partway across the lake. Their hands were sore, and their arms and backs were tired. They were worn out. Huge waves were splashing into their boat. If the boat should fill up, they would sink. How they must have wished that Jesus was with them to calm the waves and the wind and say, "Peace, be still," as he had done one other time. The night was very dark. If only the moon and the stars were shining. But there were only black storm clouds in the sky. Suddenly, the men in the boat saw something moving across the water. What was coming toward them on those raging waves? The anxious disciples peered through the darkness. It came nearer and nearer and nearer. They could see it looked like the form of a man. "Look, look," they cried to each other. "It's walking on the water. What is it?" The disciples were terrified because they were terrified of drowning too. But just then a voice came to them across the water. "Be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid," the speaker did not need to say. "It is Jesus," for they all knew his voice. Could it really be their master stepping over the waves as easily as if he were on dry land? The disciples drew back. They were still frightened at the strange sight. But Peter sprang to the edge of the boat. He called out bravely, this is Peter, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." None of the other disciples would have dared to do such a thing. "Come," said Jesus. Immediately, Peter leapt out of the boat on the water, with his eyes fixed on Jesus. His face, he began to walk across the waves. And the other disciples watched in amazement and fear. When Peter was almost at Jesus' side, he suddenly realized what impossible thing he was doing. He was walking on the water in the middle of a stormy lake. He looked around, felt the fierce wind blowing about him, and saw the big black waves at his feet. He was afraid. He was afraid, and he began to sink. Oh, just look at even the wave is sinking. He began to sink. In terror, he cried out, "Lord, save me," and reached out his hand toward Jesus. At once the Lord stretched out his strong hand. He took hold of Peter's hand and lifted him up again. "Oh, Peter, why couldn't you keep on believing that I would hold you up?" Jesus asked him. Did Jesus scold Peter for trying to do too much? No. He was just scolding Peter because he wanted him to trust him more. Together, Jesus and Peter walked to the boat. How safe Peter felt. He was sorry he had stopped looking at Jesus and looked at the tossing waves. The wind might have blown him around and the spray might have wet his clothes, but he knew he would have been safe as long as he kept on believing Jesus and kept on looking only at him. Jesus was God's Son. When Jesus drew near the boat, the fear of the disciples changed to relief and delight. They gave him a big welcome. And the boat sailed safely back to shore. And they were safe once more from the storm.